This is Frank Benford, a physicist in the late 1920s who was about to discover something so simple yet revolutionary, not just for maths, but for crime, for justice, and for truth itself. It started when he was flipping through the pages of his morning newspaper, and he noticed something strange. The number 1 was appearing way more often than it statistically should. If you counted every single number in this copy of the Daily Mail, you would expect that the amount of numbers that started with 1 would be around about the same as the amount of numbers that started with 2, or 3, or 9, but they don't. In fact, it follows a very interesting pattern. Curious, Benford decided to try and find this pattern by collecting over 20,000 different numbers from as many pieces of literature as he could find. Baseball statistics, river lengths, populations, even street addresses, noting down every single leading number that he found. And lo and behold, a pattern started to emerge. Numbers that started with 1 appeared a staggering 30.1% of the time. This was closely followed by numbers that started with 2 at 17.6% of the time, and the rest of the numbers steadily decreased from there, with 9 only appearing 4.6% of the time. And this formed a beautiful relationship known as Benford's law. But so what? Why is that such an important discovery in the history of mathematics? And more importantly, how does that help us commit fraud? Well, mathematical laws are called laws for a reason, and that's because most numbers follow them. Imagine for a second that you're trying to sneak in to a massive black tie event. Everyone there is wearing suits, and you walk in a clown outfit. You're going to be sussed out as an imposter very quickly, a liar, a fraud, compared to if you were just to walk in with a suit like everyone else, if you had tried to fit in. If you were to theoretically try and lie on your tax form, how would you go about it? Well, you'd probably try and blend your numbers in with the rest of the numbers, try and make them fit in and be almost random looking like the others, right? Right now, think of 5 random numbers between 1 and 100. I'll give you like 3 seconds or so, because that should be enough. What you'll notice with your selection that you've just made is that you try to fill the space. You spread your numbers out relatively evenly. You wouldn't just end up picking 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 because that's a pattern. But the thing is, your brain isn't very good at being random. For instance, was one of your numbers 37 or 73? Because if it wasn't, that's pretty awkward. You definitely wouldn't have picked either 1 or 100 because I said that out loud. And you wouldn't have gone for 50 because, well, it's halfway in between. That's not very random at all. But randomness doesn't mean even, and your brain subconsciously spreading out your numbers is a pattern that's about as obvious as a clown going to a black tie dinner. All of the numbers on a tax form will follow Benford's law pretty accurately, as long as you're telling the truth. And that's why the IRS use Benford's law to detect fraud. They'll take your tax form, they will add up every single number, and if those numbers don't match the percentages, it probably means you're an idiot and you've tried to get out of paying tax. Now, I genuinely cannot put into words how powerful of a tool this has been for uncovering truth since we've discovered it. For instance, in 2023, Trung My Lan, a Vietnamese businesswoman, was sentenced to death. She was secretly controlling one of the country's biggest banks and using fake loan applications to steal $44 billion. But she got away with doing that for over a decade before she was discovered by Benford's law. In 2003, the US hospital chain HealthSouth was exposed by the FBI for inflating their profits by $2.7 billion. They used thousands of fake accounting entries that were small enough to avoid auditing, but a lot of those entries started with a 4 and a 5. halfway between 1 and 9. Classic human randomness. Even global politics is not safe from this law, since back in 2020, massive headlines were made about the US elections. Joe Biden's votes in certain areas did not follow Benford's law, and that started a huge investigation into possible election rigging. But why does this happen? It just still feels like a massive coincidence. Why exactly does the number 1 show up more than the number 9? Shouldn't numbers be fair? No, absolutely not. It's to do with a thing called scale invariance, and the best way I can think to explain it is like you're entering a raffle. What is the probability that the winning ticket of a raffle will have a lead number of 1? Well, it depends how many tickets are in the raffle. Let's say there's only 2 tickets. The probability is 1 in 2, or 50%. If you add another ticket, it becomes 33%, 4, 25%, 5, 20%, and it slowly declines like so, until there's 9 tickets in the raffle. Then the probability is about 11%. But then you add the 10th ticket. Now there's 2 tickets in the raffle with a leading number of 1. So the probability is now 2 in 10, or 1 in 5, 20%. The percentage starts to slowly increase as you add numbers starting with 1. So 11, 12, 13, all the way up to 19 tickets, where the probability is about 58%. Until, of course, you add the 20th ticket. The percentage starts to go down and down and down until you reach the 100th ticket, where it starts to increase again, all the way up until the 200th ticket, where of course, then it starts to go down again, all the way to the 1000th ticket, where you're coincidentally right back at 11%. If you were to graph that out with the probability of a leading number being 1 against a log scale of the number of tickets in the raffle, so 10, 100, 1000, 10,000, you get this weird looking saw blade. The thing that Benford realised is when you pick a number randomly from the world, it's like picking a raffle ticket and not knowing the size of the raffle. For instance, it would be practically impossible to find out how many house numbers exist on the entire planet. So, instead of having to do that and then extending the graph all the way, instead we just take the average, which is about around there. And that number, when it's properly calculated, comes out to 30.1%. Now there is a relatively simple formula for this, and it goes about as follows. The probability of picking a number, let's say D, is equal to log base 10 of 1 plus 1 over D. If you were to plug 1 into this, you'd get 30.1, plug 2 into it, you get 17.6, and so on and so forth. That is how Benford's law was derived. Now there is a slightly more intuitive way to think about this if this isn't really up your street, but I will admit that it only made sense to me after I watched the number file video on Benford's law, so all credit to them. If you want to get from 1,000 to 2,000, then you have to double it, of course, and that is a 100% increase to get from a number with a leading digit of 1 to a leading digit of 2. But if you want to get from 9,000 to 10,000, the same distance, you're only increasing by 11%. 11% increase to get from a leading digit of 9 all the way back to a leading digit of 1. So in short, you don't really tend to hang around these higher numbers for as long as you do these lower ones. Cool, right? So the next time someone gets exposed for tax fraud that's been doing it for quite a while, just give them a little bit of silent respect, because they did at least know some pretty cool maths.